Hello, everybody, and welcome to philosopheckery. We have a very interesting and special guest here on the podcast today, all the way from, I think he's in Maine at the moment, but normally in Iowa. He's a professor of philosophy at Simpson College in Iowa and the director of interdisciplinary studies. And he has come on here today to talk about the myth of farming and the crisis of the mythology of farming and the crisis of democracy. Is there anything else you'd like to add to that, John? It's very brief.
No, that's fine. I think we can have our discussion rather than talk about credentials or anything.
Okay, thanks, John.
I'd rather
Thanks.
do that.
Yeah, I understand that, but yeah, just to let the listeners know, there's plenty of credentials and work that we could be talking about. Yeah, I've read up some things that what your students have been saying on some of these websites, and they're all very, very happy with you, and they're very grateful for the support
Thank
and
you.
the help that you've given them. So that's very
I'm
nice.
grateful to the students.
That's a very nice way to look at it. So I heard you speak up at NUI, and I found what you were saying very interesting. So I wonder, would you like to give us a rundown of your work on the mythology of farming and the crisis of democracy?
Yeah, I can. It's actually, I think, important maybe to know why a an academic philosopher would be pursuing the subject of agriculture, and so I can say a few things briefly that I have always had an interest in agriculture since I was in college. I used to go to the lectures. I went to University of Massachusetts, and it was originally a land grant. It was a land grant university, and it was originally an agricultural college. The name of that college is Stockbridge, and they would have lectures on Friday afternoons, and I would go down and listen to the various lecturers. And I took some classes in college, couple classes that were about agriculture, economics, and politics. Then when I got to Simpson, I didn't, I took the job at Simpson. It's a small liberal arts college, and I didn't know really anything at all about industrial agriculture. So when my wife and I first drove into Iowa, kind of naively, not knowing much about the Midwest either, there was corn on both sides of the highway, and I thought it was sweet corn, and that's actually what a lot of people think traveling through the Midwest still. But once you find out, right, everything changes. Anyway, so I was invited to be a PI actually on a research project in 2015 about herbicide resistant weeds. This seems really weird, but they needed somebody who could do interdisciplinary work and help some of the students involved who were not they were not all just science students. And I gradually got more and more involved in the whole picture of agriculture in the Midwest and in the United States. And I started to see, right, the systematic nature of it, and the what I took to be what immediately grabbed me were the enormous problems, because the actually when you start looking at this issue of an herbicide resistant weed and how it can interfere with yield, you step right into right the middle of this system. And then you start to realize, well, why are these weeds herbicide resistant? And it goes from there. And since then, I've become more and more involved in trying to understand the system, which has pulled me into politics and cultural philosophy. Understanding the agricultural system is to a large extent understanding the current and historical culture of Iowa and the Middle West. So
Okay.
that's about as brief as I can. There's a lot more to the story, but that should give
Yeah.
people listening some idea of what's going on with me.
Yeah, it's funny. I was talking to my dad who lives in Long Island, and I told him I was going to be interviewing a professor from Iowa about the mythology around farming up there. And then he instantly said, I drove through it, he said, and wow. He said, it's amazing. The size of the farms there. And I'm pretty sure he thought it was sweet corn, like I probably would, like I did until you just said it. But, and he's from a farming background as a child up in Mayo here
Really?
near Galway. Yeah, so he was super impressed by the scale
Oh
of
yeah.
the farming up there.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that's something about what really caught me in your talk in Galway was the impression people have when they see big farms like that. And especially my dad is closing in on 80. So
Mm-hmm.
he'd have come from a time when, oh my God, that's amazing to be doing that much farming at that scale. I think people now might look at it with slightly different eyes and
Mm-hmm.
think, why do we need to be doing farming at that big of a scale? You know, or there might be
Yeah.
different questions that arise. But his generation thinks it's amazing, just the ability that we
Well,
have to do it.
I think it's hard from pretty much any perspective not to think that it's amazing, because when you look at the raw numbers, just the yields, the the corn yield last year in Iowa was 2.5 billion bushels, and a bushel is 56 pounds. And so actually, you can sort of do the math, add up the zeros, but you quickly outstrip your mental capacity to understand, right, that number. It's too big a number to really hold in your head. And then also, I'll just give you another example. 50 million hogs brought to market in the state of Iowa. That's also, I think, inconceivable numbers.
Yeah,
Just asking yourself, how is that done? How did and it's hard to understand. And then someone I really respect, Chris Jones. He's a water quality expert in the state of Iowa. Spent years at the University of Iowa and is currently writing and thinking about all these subjects. His main view is that the whole problem is actually the problem of scale. I mean, you could do this kind of farming, but just scale way back.
yeah, and like there must be a demand for all that, all them 50 million hogs, and
Yeah.
so is that part of the like that? This is where we get into the politics and economics of it, isn't it? Where it's very hard to not do it when the demand is there. No?
Yeah, there's a number of things that go into this, and I'm not honestly, I'm not knowledgeable enough. I'm still working on this to understand the economics. It's That's something that I'm not as nearly as good at as the politics, but the two are ultimately connected, obviously. Just there's the renewable fuel standard. I think I'm trying to remember when it went into operation. early 2000s, maybe 2003, something like that. And so the demand for ethanol, the for liquid fuel, has pushed the demand for corn and keeps pushing it. And so 60% of the corn that I was telling you about, the 2.5 billion bushels, 60% of it goes to ethanol, and 40% goes to livestock feed. And then
Okay.
just one other thing to mention, which is I think this gets us into the mythology of agriculture and farming. There's a slogan in Iowa that's been used for several years now, that Iowa feeds the world.
Yeah, but you've
But
just demolished
right,
that.
and then they point to, right, these amazing numbers, but actually the number of people who are actually being fed. Are you there?
Yeah, yeah. Can you hear me?
I was worried that it froze for a second. The actual number of people who are being fed, right, and also, um, are they people who are like desperate for food? Are they people who we really should be paying attention to with respect to, hunger? The
Yeah,
answer is no. I mean, pork is right. I mean, middle
yeah,
class, people who really need the food, even in the state of Iowa, they're not getting it from Iowa agriculture.
yeah. And that's yeah. And pork is not. It's not exactly the healthiest diet either. If our concern was feeding people for the good of the people to keep them healthy, I'm not sure pork it would be the first choice.
It's certainly not the most sustainable. And, you know, actually, though, my work in Ireland, I was doing a bunch of research, and talking to people from Chagas, really, really good people, by the way, really enjoyed talking to them. And, I talked to this one beef farmer, and I asked him about hormones and antibiotics, and I cannot believe that farmers in the United States are feeding their cattle and hogs with growth hormones. We would never do
Crazy.
that. And that's, I
Um,
mean,
yeah, yeah. They say they'd never do it, but I wonder if it was legal to do it and there was massive profits available to do it. It could possibly change. I'm sure that there's nice people
well,
that wouldn't do it, but
there's the mythology of farming for you right there. That the image of the farmer is of, right, this, almost impossible human being, super virtuous steward of the land and of the community, etc. But I mean, let's face it, your point is very good. Given the right incentives, right, they will, if it's a matter of, like, they're like everybody else, in other words.
exactly.
Given the economic incentives that you just mentioned, well, they're probably going to start giving growth hormones.
They probably will, and
Yeah.
it's like it's like steroids in sports. If there is a few people that aren't doing it and everybody else is doing it, well, then they're either quit the sport or or they start taking the steroids. And just it's the same for the
Yeah,
farmer.
that's
They
true.
they
Yeah.
either quit farming or they start giving the hormones to the
That's a
animals.
very good point, and it also, the slide from, it being an immoral sort of practice to being somehow acceptable, morally acceptable. I think as more and more people do it, I mean, this is obviously fallacious, but this
Yeah,
is the way I think sometimes people reason, which is, well,
yeah,
everyone's doing it, so I'm going to do it. Which is,
yeah.
we learned when we were little kids that that's not exactly good reasoning.
Yeah, I don't know if you had this saying from parents, but it was back here. It was, well, if your friend jumped off a bridge, would you do it too? Uh,
Right.
and the truth is, we used to
Right.
jump off the bridge here in Galway all the time. So, but
Right. And if it's
yeah,
in if it's in my short and maybe also long-term self-interest, then I have to actually start thinking about, right, the short-term and long-term interest of the community. Right, and that's a little bit more difficult, I think, for people to do, than thinking in terms of their own self-interest, and they don't always see the connection between their own self-interest and the interest of the community.
Absolutely. And I think that's something that's getting worse a little bit on the overall. I think technology, social media, the internet, there's many great things. But when it first came about, we all thought there's going to be a brilliant epistemic boost from this. Everybody's going to be so smart and everybody's going to be so together and so connected and the world will feel as one. And these were the kind of optimistic dreams, techno dreams that people had. But I'm not sure it's really gone that way. I think there's a certain narcissism and atomism that has come from it. I think a lot of people spend more time on screens than they do talking to people, and they find their community not geographically local, but more online, if that makes sense.
No, I don't think I could agree with you more strongly in that the technology involved in agriculture, I think it's had a similar kind of outcome that we didn't think about all of the, and we can't, all of the possible consequences. But we should, I think, as rational agents, we should be able to say to ourselves, in embarking on something like you were, the internet, or embarking on AI, or embarking on large scale industrial farming, that there are going to be consequences that we do not fully understand, or that we could not, let's say, have predicted. So I think, and you put it well when you talked about the epistemic, the epistemic content. Like we sort of think we know everything in order to make these decisions and to make these claims, but we don't, and we keep learning that lesson over and over and over, and it doesn't seem like that we're actually really learning it.
Yeah,
So I agree with you. And the narcissism thing is, you spend all your time talking to people and sort of on social media. It's often the case that people are self-promoting, and you don't talk to people in person. So your limitations, your own limits, your own problems, you can sort of eliminate them.
Yeah, yeah. I feel like people make an avatar of themselves in the online world, and then they try to live up to that avatar, which for me becomes a downward force from technology, kind of telling humans how to be human rather than us using technology for the betterment of not just humans, but the rest of nature. And this, that's a long conversation, but
actually, I have a question for you that I think you and I can kind of meet here, because I didn't really, in the paper that I gave at the university, I didn't really talk much about the value and meaning of myth. And a lot of people, they think of myth as just being simply fiction, right? And in the new context, or in this context of the internet and social media, we're frequently talking also about misinformation. And it might be that people start thinking that, misinformation and fiction are kind of the same thing. but they're not. So I just wanted to ask you about, when you were asking me and you were talking about, you were really meaning, I think, to say something about the importance of myth.
Yeah. What I took from your talk initially was that you were saying we should do away with myth and just go with science. Um, I now know that's not what you were saying, but that's what got me animated, and I have my hand
I
up,
can
and I
see how
think
you I can see how you would make that inference, given what I said about ecological literacy.
yeah, yeah,
I I
and
get
how the myth of farming that was present in Iowa didn't really match the reality, and it didn't put us in touch with the need for biodiversity, rather the opposite.
right.
What I think about myth, uh, okay, I think that language is our first step to individuating things in the world conceptually. I think everything is interrelated. I'm a bit of a hippie in that way. So I think everything is interrelated, and the only thing that individuates it is language. So that's how we take apart the world. That's how we conceptualize things in our head, and that's the only way humans can do what they do. I'm sorry, John. I have to plug the battery in for this. I can't believe I left it up.
That's okay.
Okay, showing my amateur status there. Yeah, so myth. So the way I feel about myth, think about myth, reason about myth, is that myth kept us in contact with that holism. It didn't separate us completely from the world, in that we kept the rest of the world animated. And that was important, because then we could have feelings about it. We could have moral intuitions about it. And the further we've come from myth, like we have the mythos logos thing in ancient Greece at the start, and then we have the Enlightenment, which kind of done away with it altogether. And I feel like there was a cleaving there, that we stopped thinking about the rest of nature as anything but material for our use,
Mm,
anything but just at Heidegger say a tree became a table. You know,
yeah.
the way we saw the world, it stopped being animated, and we stopped caring about it, and it justified, along with giving us the power to basically do what we've done and destroy most of the rest of nature. I mean, I don't think there's a part of the world that doesn't have microplastics in it right now. And that's why I think myth is important, because there is a connection. And there is, I feel there's myths available from indigenous communities, including the Irish indigenous, the pre-Christian Irish Brehon law and those things, that they held on to that connection. And when you look at some of the moves now that are in like quantum mechanics and physics and stuff, it's bringing us around to maybe some of them myths were truer than the myths we have going on now. You know, that everything is interrelated. There's one example in Brehon law. It was illegal to kill a white butterfly. And that was because we believed butterflies carried the souls of our dead, and the white butterfly carried the souls of dead children. But just having these myths around, not only do they make life richer, make our view of the world and nature richer, but they place upon us moral responsibilities towards the rest of nature, which I think is missing, not just on a top-down level, but a bottom-up as well. It's missing from individuals, and it's missing from governments, and it's missing from the economic setups that just incentivize profit above everything else. Um, and so this is a double-edged sword with me with myth, because I think there's, again, the misinformation and stuff you talked about online. I think there's a certain amount of, shall we say, a poetic sense of the world that goes into believing a lot of these stories, as in, I'll use January 6th as an example. I don't think there was a lot of bad people there, but I think they had stitched a story together which gave them a view of the world where they thought they were actually fighting the good fight, where they thought they were defending their values and they were defending children. So I find it hard to say there were bad people, but they were believing the wrong myth. They were believing the wrong story. They had, but I genuinely think that they were often doing it from a good place, if you will. They were trying to defend what they believed was important, but of course they were very, very mistaken.
Yeah,
So
I, I see what you're saying, and I to make a broader point that will connect with what you're saying um, about stories and fiction. That yes, the story, let's say, is fictional in that such and such never happened, etc. But it doesn't follow from that we can't see something revealed that's very important about reality from that story. So we have to be able to balance, in our minds and our lives between, what's literally true and what's true that we find in stories and myths. And what you were saying about some of the indigenous people and their myths about nature and so on, it turns out, right, that they have like ecological grounding. I mean, these myths are founded in a way of expressing their experience, and as it turns out, as you're saying, right, a lot of these myths, they reveal what we take to be true about ecology. So I mean, when you said that you think everything's connected, and that's kind of a hippie view or whatever, if you go and look at axioms, principles of ecology, the first principle is that everything is connected,
but then how do
in
we?
one way or another.
Yeah. So so is individualism a myth? Is it a myth? Is the atomistic self a myth? Is
I
it a
was
myth?
just, yeah, actually, when I was exercising this morning, I was thinking about this podcast, and I was thinking about the myths that surround farming and my sort of criticism of it. I think individualism has been is a myth in the United States culture, and it's been a very useful and important myth. But I think it's gone off the rails to what you're talking about, a kind of a radical atomism, and that's used in politics frequently as a way of, I think, discriminating and separating people. There are the people who have earned their way, and you know um, through their own
Bootstraps.
individual effort and so on, and there are other people who have failed. And this is about also the myth of success, and you start tying these things together. You go back and you look at, right, what might be true and valuable about the initial myth, that, right, certain contexts in human life and historical epochs have required, right, very, very strong individuals. But that's not the same thing as saying that human beings are atoms. So
Yeah.
I think, I think this is definitely where you need philosophy this is where the culture needs philosophical analysis. And we have to be able to pay attention to it and think through it. It's part of meta reflection. We
Yeah.
can't just coast on our stories, right? We have to do some analysis so that, right, we don't do serious damage to ourselves.
Yeah. Absolutely. And not just ourselves either. I think
Right, not
individualism
just to
is
ourselves, right?
yeah. I think individualism is useful and has given us a lot of valuable things. But I don't know if useful and valuable are the same thing as truth.
They're not.
They're not.
I
So
I I,
and
I agree with that. Yeah.
it's the like free will puts the onus on everybody to have some self control and self discipline. That doesn't necessarily mean it's true, but it's very valuable. It's very important for our
I
society that people act in that way. But
Right.
that
At least they believe it, right?
at least they
And
believe it.
by believing it, they actually, right, we get the behavior that we would want.
Exactly. But does that in itself not kind of do away with the idea that free will is it's the story of free will that has that effect rather than free will itself, which kind of does away with free will in itself in that it's still a downward kind of effect.
Right. And we're, of course, in danger of going into sort of a pure ontology of free will. And
Yeah.
that would be for a different discussion.
Yeah.
But I would just be wary of, I got two things. One is I'd be wary of the manipulation of myth, intentional manipulation of myth to get results. Then you start, on this um, very definite sort of means to ends, and that'll come to the service of all kinds of things that we don't necessarily want. But then I was going to also to go sort of back to the beginning about myth and what I was trying to say in the paper, just to clarify. Wittgenstein had, 3 short lectures on Freud. I don't know how much was actually captured in the lectures, but I go back to them. And he claimed that, Freud was engaged in myth, really not science. But then what you would expect, maybe what some people would expect, was for Wittgenstein to say, well, because he's engaged in myth and not science, what Freud's doing is useless. It's just involved in fiction, fiction in that derogatory sense. But that's not what Wittgenstein said. He said that Freud actually was giving us ways of thinking about human beings and humanity in ways that were very important. So you
Yeah.
can open up a door to thinking with a myth.
Yeah. 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 And I think, like for my thinking, all of our thoughts and rationality is done by language. And then when you go into the neuroscience of it, um, language over time builds our neural pathways. So
Yeah.
it literally does influence our thought or almost engineer our thought to a certain extent and certainly create boundaries around.
Have you ever
Um,
have you ever heard of a guy named Andrew Clark?
Andrew Clark, no.
Yeah, he's I think he's British or Scottish. I don't remember, but he writes about exactly what you're talking about.
Okay.
It's I don't mean to give you a reading list.
Oh, please do.
You kind of prompted me. He's got this essay called Magic Words that I've I've read and reread that is just on the point that you're making.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of cognitive science now currently is on the point that you're making.
Okay, that's I'm very glad to hear that. Yeah, because I've had discussions with psychologists who think I'm nuts. At least that's the impression I get sometimes. But
No, I don't think you're nuts.
there's in my dissertation, speaking of magic words and how they influence how we behave and our morality, what I was attempting to argue towards was that our use of language for everything that's not human should be simply the rest of nature. That's enough. It doesn't take us out of it, and it just says the rest of nature, and that perhaps that could be shortened to the acronym of RON, and we could just start calling it Ron, and almost it can be Rhonda, it can be Ronald, and just so we have maybe one of those magic words that we can create a concept for people that they can have moral feelings towards everything that's not human, because all our morality seems to be centered around what's good for human. Even a lot of the talk around the environment, it's like, yeah, but what about humanity? And humanity
Well,
is great
yeah.
for humans.
When you talk about when you discuss the creation of concepts, I think you're very much onto something. That if you're going to change the way the culture behaves, you have to change and alter the conceptual system. There's no break between concepts really and behavior, in my view. That right, our behavior is seamlessly connected to our thinking and our beliefs and desires and so forth. And so, to go back to farming and industrial agriculture, I think to break that up in a real sense means that you really have to start thinking about, as you were saying, nature and food and production and so forth. We have to start thinking about it in different ways. And that's going to mean altering our conceptual system.
And when you say we and us, um, I mean, that's both the farmer, the consumer, the salesperson, the the tractor mechanic. That everybody involved needs to get on board. I like we were saying, the incentives would be too strong to put this all on farmers. You
Oh,
know,
absolutely. Yeah. Oh, yeah. I
you,
mean, consumers are, I mean, you look at the rate of consumption in the United States. I mean, consumers are citizens, are, right? We're an essential part of the whole thing. In a sense, we've bought into it. And as my wife was saying, when we got back to the States, we were in Ireland for 3 months, and you look at the wealth in the U.S. and the consumption, and it is quite amazing. And we to achieve, right, what we're talking about, with sustainability and an environmentally sound policy, it can't be simply a matter of making laws. It's similar to the civil rights movement, right? You've got to change the way that people think. And, right now in the United States, I don't, there are lots of people working towards this, but I wouldn't I wouldn't say that it's the best picture right now. It's going to be, I think, very difficult to push back and alter the way we think here in the US about consumption. It's again tied into other things like individual rights and property rights, and it goes on and on. That's what I mean when I say we have to adjust the conceptual system at least enough so that we can stop wanton destruction.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't think that's just America either. Like America, as in the conceptual unit that is America, it that that really came from Europe. I feel like America. Like I think everybody, I know me and lots of my friends and people I know, at some stage or another were in love with what America was trying to be. Really, really were. But I feel like America is the child of Europe in a way,
Definitely.
conceptual way. We, but I don't want to say that to a Native American. That'd be a horrible thing to say. But um, and it's like that favorite child that had everything going for it, and then got a cocaine addiction at 16. Just before it actually could flourish into what it was uh, trying to be.
Right, what it could have been.
Yeah, yeah,
And I guess I'm still one of these people who I still have a belief that it's possible. No throwing in the towel.
no,
So, I hear about people, upper middle class people in the U.S. and beyond saying, who are progressives and they're going to leave the U.S., can't take it anymore, have to go someplace else. And I'm not one of those. I think there's a lot here worth fighting for. And I don't mean, with a gun. I mean fighting for in the
yeah,
ways we're talking about.
yeah,
It's surprising how you find, sometimes it's surprising how you find like-minded people. You can easily become convinced that you're in a tiny minority when in fact there are plenty of citizens in Iowa, for instance, who see the damage being done by industrial agriculture, and the reason I think that it's so important right now is because the politics in the U.S. have changed so much since the dawn of Trump
absolutely.
that that we getting things changed in the ways that you and I are talking about, that we have regressed. You know,
Absolutely. I feel like
right? The
that too.
politics in Iowa right now very much favor the continuation of industrial agriculture, the continuation of the myths that we were talking about, individualism and atomism, and also the splendors and wonders of consumption, even though a lot of Iowa citizens are not getting that benefit from the agricultural system. So, I think that turn in politics has been crucial. And you talked about what could have been. Well, if we had different politics, which means a lot of different things, but we might be much farther along than we are now. For example, in Europe, I can't help but to notice it's obvious that people take, right, greenhouse gas emissions and climate change, right, very seriously. They're not thinking of it as being a hoax, at least not like in the US. So when you're dealing with that kind of political context and social cultural context, right, the change that we're talking about gets that much harder.
It does. It does. And And there's plenty of that thinking in Europe too. There really is. There's a rise of right wing thinking here.
Oh, I've been reading about that, yeah. And
Yeah, there.
I'm sure that my own experience was right. It was it's not exactly like I'm traveling around and just talking to anyone. I'm talking about talking to researchers.
Yeah,
But I do have to say that the people I talked about in the pubs and at dinner and stuff, I spent a lot of time conversing with people. I, I, I got more of the sense that yes, climate change is real and we have to do something about it. In the States, it can become serious antagonism quickly. And that may be the case you can tell me, that may be the case more and more in Europe with, maybe we've infected some of Europe with the Reds, all the red politics.
yeah. Yeah, absolutely. The cocaine-ridden teenager came home and caused trouble. That's
Yeah,
that's. But
right.
and that has. But was that I can't compare because I haven't been to America talking to people about these things, so I don't really have a direct comparison. All I have is what I see on through screens, and that has its own kind of filters. But was it so much different in America in 2015 having these kind of conversations
No,
before
I don't
Trump?
know if it was. I don't know if it was that much different. There's various hypotheses about what's going on here. One is that Trump, you could call it. You don't have to call it Trump. Just X.
Yeah,
This change in America, it what it did was it pulled off a certain veneer, and now a lot of people feel free and uninhibited to express their real opinions about race and about religion and about um, the gay and lesbian community, the trans community. I mean, all these things now, people are just, they feel free to say whatever that is on their mind. And I guess maybe all things considered, feeling free to say what's really on your mind is part of what it is to live in a democracy. But I think that hypothesis is probably right. It's not like millions of people suddenly became racist in 2015. It's that there was a significant amount of racism in the United States, um, and I think you can point to all sorts of stuff for evidence. And now people really are sort of articulating it. I mean, I
yeah,
just can't imagine. It's hard for me to think about, right, someone who's running for president just coming out and sort of saying the things that Trump says and having people applaud it.
yeah,
So
yeah,
I mean, that's one idea. We may not ever be able to get to the bottom of the etiology and the causation. We just have to confront what what's
yeah.
directly available empirically. And
So,
it's tense.
yeah, I imagine it is. Um, it's tense for us here watching it over there as well because America has such a massive influence on the world. So if America implodes, we really don't know what we'll do. Europe has been so peaceful because America has been the gun in its holster for a long time since the Second World War. So maybe I feel like Europe has a responsibility towards America too. Do you know?
Mm.
There's such a massive connection. When,
That would be a great thing, I believe, and it's just that one problem with that is that there are a lot of people in the U.S. now who have adopted a kind of cultural atomism that has to do with this myth of American exceptionalism, and so right, cooperating with other nations. I think you can sort of see this in Trump has basically a belligerent view about right international politics, and a lot of people, I think, like that. And then there's also the isolationists. We don't want to we don't want to support Ukraine. I mean, where is that coming from? I mean, this is a crisis, right? Of This is a massive crisis. And so, anyway, I just think that I agree with you. More and more international cooperation. I mean,
Yeah.
I've sort of suggested, well, to some friends, but I happen to think the EU is a great thing, and at least in principle. And then I think, right, Canada, United States, and Mexico, right, we could form a similar sort of union. But boy, I mean, um, that's not going to go over well.
No, no. I have I've said it for many years about things, and as you know, we had a problem here with a little border we have up at the top of our country. Um,
Yeah.
but I think we need less lines in the world, not more of them. I
Hmm.
genuinely think we need to like these borders are conceptual before they were material. So
Yeah.
that is
Right.
the genesis of those two is how we think. And um, I remember when I was young in this little town. We have a river, the Corrib, running through the town. Uh, and when I was young, we used to fight with the guys from what we call the west side. We were on the east side of the river. They were on the west side. And then some of my friends, we grew into men, and some of my friends went to America. And they met some of the guys from the west side of the river, and sure, they were all best of friends over there then. So all you have to do is draw a line in between people and tell them they're different on either side of it. And that'll start the conflict, Uh,
Right.
I really think so much of this is just in how we think, just in the way we think and the concepts that are available to us. The concepts that we cling to, concepts like nationalism, the identities that we cling to. Uh, there's a lot about identity now and identity politics, but I don't like it. I don't like that. I don't like the defenders, and I don't like the opposition in how firmly they hold their beliefs. I was doing research for a film company last year, and they were going making a movie, uh, a documentary actually, about a circus in Palestine. This was before all the recent trouble kicked off over there. And it was amazing to be looking and thinking about a circus in Palestine, in such a hard area. It's such an area that has such firm beliefs about who they are and what they are.
Sounds
And
bizarre.
it was bizarre, but I kept having this image in my head of, let's say, a street, and you have the Israelis on one side who are 100% sure of what they are, their religious beliefs, their rights. And on the other side, you have the Palestinians who have the exact same uh, kind of concepts about their beliefs, about who they are, about their religions, about their rights. And they're firing guns and rocks and bombs and everything at each other, and they're willing to die and kill each other for these identities, for these beliefs. And then you have a guy cycling in on a unicycle in the middle of it all, juggling balls. And to me, he's almost the only sane person in that whole picture. But he's the clown, you know. I think there's something to say about the perspective of that clown who can be looking around. He's the one having fun. He's the one enjoying life. And these people who have such firm beliefs of their identities that they're willing to kill other people, they're willing to harm other people, they're willing to harm nature and everything. They're the ones that has they're the ones that have faulty thinking in my mind, not the clown. I think maybe the clown is the same one here.
Well, I think, okay, so I guess the level of certainty is, you know, that's one of those crucial epistemic issues with people, and trying to change that, and some of the myths can, right, become unbreakable. And part of that, the Iowa identity is tied to agriculture, it's tied to farming, and people still talk about family farms when family farms are no longer in existence. Change has occurred at a rapid pace, and what we think of as family farms, they really don't exist anymore. But you will get the dogmatic assertion that, right, family farms are crucial to the upbringing of children and blah blah, which right, that's the certainty you're talking about, kind of dogmatism.
Yeah, yeah. Did you? There was something you said in your talk that really struck me. I thought it was a very good point. You talked about the cleanliness of fields in Iowa,
Yeah.
and
Mm-hmm.
how that signified a good farmer in the mythology. That, oh, your field is clean, you must have put a lot of work in, because that mythology was built through a time where that actually took humans working the field and keeping it clean and keeping the ground and keeping all the pests away and protecting your crop. Um, but you said that mythology is still alive. However,
Very much.
a
Yeah.
clean field now signifies something much different, like a dead soil, a lack of biodiversity, uh, and but yet it's still looked at, and that's when I thought about my dad driving up to Iowa, and seeing these fields and going, wow, they're great farmers,
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, a classic case of appearance and reality, and an irony, a really dangerous irony, that pristine, which essentially means clean, spotless, etc. But when you look just below the surface, literally, what you have is a toxicity. The field is a technological freak. If you went to the 1940s and saw photographs, or 50s, of photograph of the corn crop, and they used to say knee high by the 4th of July. That was a slogan, that, and that tells you something about the healthy growth of the corn. And then when it's finally over and done, you might have 6-foot corn stalks, and you would harvest. And now now the corn stalks are 10, 11, feet tall. And the ordinary citizen doesn't, you can't see the change. The change is in, right, the chemicals. It's also in the DNA. It's also in the hybrids and the seed technology, drought resistant seeds and so forth. But to go back to pristine, right, uh, those chemicals, and I've done work on this, and I'm doing more in looking at the pounds per acre in Ireland, hectare, U.S. acre. They're not the same, but it's measuring the size of the field. Sometimes, right, 2,000 pounds of herbicide or more per acre over, I don't know, 20 years. What does that mean? And then Iowa also, something that they try to keep quiet, is the cancer rate in Iowa is now number 2 in the United States. And when you think of a rural environment, I think this is part of the myth too. You think of health and
yes,
well-being, and fresh air and the countryside and all that. Countryside in Iowa is quite dangerous. And I you know, once that cancer study came out, people were saying, well, what are the causes? And, hypothesizing and so on, well, Midwesterners, they drink too much and they smoke too much. That must be it. That's not going to account for this dramatic rise in cancers. It's just not.
It's another way to
So,
point at the individual, though, isn't it?
right. And
As to find
pristine
the
here
fault.
pristine here is very, very dangerous because this aesthetic concept, or I called it a quasi aesthetic concept, it it obscures, right, deeply. It makes opaque the whole picture. The pristine field of healthy, clean, and really the truth is the radical opposite.
And
I,
yeah,
I mean, I don't see any other way to, unless someone wants to refute, right, the amount of herbicides being put into the ground, but you can just go to the U.S. Geological Survey and look it up.
yeah,
So it's
and
it's very disturbing to me that, and when we did the research on herbicide resistant weeds, we ran into all sorts of people who used that word pristine. It is a word. If you get out there into the rural Iowa and you talk to farmers and other stakeholders, they will use that term, or they'll talk about clean fields.
and that word pristine, then, is that the goal for them farmers? Like you were saying,
Absolutely,
that's how
but
they want it to be.
they won't. When we did that research and we talked to people about crop insurance, which is, there's a federal crop insurance program in the United States. Crop failure, you'll get reimbursed. You'll get money from the federal government if the crops fail because of flooding, because of hailstorms, because of excess heat, or a radical drought. Every single farmer we talked to, and we talked to a lot, said that they would never take crop insurance for um, invasive weed crop yield reduction. They would never do it. And they're saying we're not, and they would also say stuff like, well, we're not like North Carolina or Kansas. Those farmers are different. We're Iowa farmers. And there's no way that we're going to be, our crops will be destroyed by a weed. That's just not going to happen. And
And
if you do travel across the state and you look at these fields, you will be amazed. I mean, you're talking about just dirt. And if you're talking about just soil, bare between the corn and the soybean will canopy over weeds and choke them out sometimes. But, weeds, that's why they're weeds. I mean, they can grow in all sorts of conditions. They're just not there.
and for the Iowa farmer, they're saying that as a point of pride, as though they were in the
That is a
field
point of
pulling them
pride.
up with their hand day after day. But
That's a lot.
that's not
Those
exactly
days
what's
are
causing the pristiness. No.
those days are over. Any kind of they used to call it walking the beans. Those days are long gone, and so and because of herbicide resistance, we have more and more a more variety of chemicals going into the soil. So forget Roundup. I mean, it works. Most farmers in Iowa do not. They will not simply use Roundup. They'll use Roundup maybe once, and then they'll use. I think the Australians call it a double knock. So you use Roundup, and then you'll use something else: atrazine, dicamba, in some cases even paraquat, depending on the the sort of weed we're talking about.
I'm not sure what those big words are of them chemicals, but they sound to me a lot like cancer.
Well, if you look at, I didn't know anything about this either. Honestly, one before I started, I mean, I an herbicide is an herbicide,
Yeah,
but paraquat has been used around the world, and it's very, very dangerous chemical. Dicamba, the research has, I mean, that's one of the problems here is that the research into the herbicides is currently inconclusive. And also, right, even though there have been, legal cases now where people have gotten millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars for exposure to Roundup, the agricultural community will insist, right, that Roundup is not carcinogenic.
and
So
it's strange that it's the people most at danger that are making the argument against their own
yeah,
health, against their own life force. It's strange how the story seems to be even stronger than the need for life, than their own health. You know,
yeah,
um,
it's very disturbing, and the way in which we accept the use of herbicides. But I think mostly in the neighborhoods with people in their gardens and so on, Roundup is, some places Roundup is say, we're not going to use glyphosate anymore. We're going to stop this and so on. But, right, the extent of the herbicides that are being used, it's 70% of the land mass in the state of Iowa is in row crops, soybean and corn. And the extent of the herbicide use is astounding. So we're not just talking about Roundup.
it's much
We're
more.
not talking about killing dandelions and killing crabgrass. We're talking about killing weeds that have evolved now past many chemicals.
So the chemicals are getting
And
stronger and stronger and more
yeah, you
destructive,
keep
I guess, to the land.
you keep I mean, by using the herbicide over and over again, you keep selecting, right, those individuals that have the resistance. So it's really a fight against the laws of nature, natural selection, in which case, right, you're doomed.
Yeah, yeah.
And
Because you're always going to get a
this is a
stronger
war
enemy
that
coming
we
at you.
will. Yeah, we this is a war that agriculture will not win.
And is there any kind of acceptance of that fact, acceptance of, well, where is this all going? I mean, the farmers, although they are fully believing in the myth and stuff, at some stage, you mentioned it a while ago, that sometimes you feel like you're in the minority when you're actually not. I think social psychology
Mhm.
calls it pluralistic ignorance.
Yeah,
In that,
I've heard of that. Yeah.
yeah, and I like to think there's a pluralistic ignorance about the holistic nature of life, about the interrelatedness of everything. I like to think that
Hmm.
there's a lot more people that actually believe that and see that, but are afraid to say it, to speak it. Like
Mm.
myself, I even denigrated myself, calling myself a bit of a hippie for believing it. But and then you have the other side of pluralistic ignorance, in that you said the kind of the Trump era, for want of a better word, brought out in people. In that maybe there was a lot of people who were really racist, but they didn't have the language or the audience that they thought would accept this
They
kind
didn't
of
have the
talk.
podium. Yeah. Hmm.
So I think there's a podium needed for a myth that can allow for this interrelatedness to take that place, where people can say, "Oh, I'm not alone in thinking this." I genuinely think that there is a lot of people that think this, but are afraid to say it, because the whole society and the whole myths that we're living in are telling people this isn't the way it is. That we,
Yeah. Uh, I'm not a. I'm not someone who does research and then stays away from, right, citizens. I like to when we put together that research project on herbicide-resistant weeds. We were focused on one weed called Palmer amaranth, and when we were done, I decided I would take a few students with me and go to conservation boards and some other types of stakeholders in counties. We ended up going to something like Iowa has 99 counties. I think we went to over 20 and gave these talks about Palmer amaranth. And you could tell about, I'm just guessing, but half the people in the audience were, you don't know what you're talking about. Farmers they'll deal with this. There won't be any sort of crisis. So you're back into that kind of pluralistic ignorance, and also the myth of the farmer when you're dealing really with natural selection. It's not that hard to understand, really. I mean, it's really not. Herbicide resistance is very basic. When you get into the actual, structure of the plant and how the chemical is supposed to kill it, then it, of course, becomes complicated and fascinating too. But equally fascinating are the ways in which the plant will not die.
Yeah, yeah.
I don't know what
And
people expected. What did they? We were talking earlier about unforeseen consequences. So the herbicide revolution, the advancement of agriculture, our ability to feed people. But finally, we have to deal with the toxicity of the herbicide. And we have to deal with herbicide resistance. And now we're dealing also with, it looks like maybe the end of the chemical revolution, in the sense that there hasn't been a new mode of action, nothing new since glyphosate, It's all going back to the old tool shed and finding chemicals that we've had for a long time and using them again.
do you genuinely think they were unforeseen at all levels?
No, not at all levels, but I do think that people with integrity and who are very smart and who know about, are richly informed. The herbicide, the herbicide resistance that we studied is, this plant Palmer amaranth is absolutely amazing. I mean,
Yeah.
we did some stuff in our lab. We didn't end up publishing anything because we don't have the facilities at our small college to be able to, but we had a student just basically pouring glyphosate on top of this Palmer amaranth plant, and it did basically nothing. A few leaves would get brown and stuff, and then it's fine. And then
Tough as all
out
boots,
in the
as they
field,
say.
we were in this awful place in Kansas. It was 107 degrees one day, and I thought I was going to pass out. But we were on this dirt road that had no gravel road that had, there was no shade anywhere. And we were trying to pull one of these Palmer amaranth plants out of the ground. And it was impossible. Its root structure was like a, spaghetti, but it also went fairly deep. It was just, nature, nature versus, if you look at it this way, and a lot of, I think, producers and people do, us versus nature, you're going to lose.
Yeah,
Nature will win. That's
absolutely.
it. The drive for life, it will win.
It will win. Do you think we have a lot of talk about the mycelium networks of forests and stuff like that now? Do you think there's an intelligence in nature that we don't take account of?
Oh my God, yes. And I do. And I think Nora Ward, she's a philosopher at, you know Nora, right?
I know Nora. Yeah, I know Nora.
Yeah.
She was.
Well, the conference I was at It was in March. No, wait. It was in April. And she gave this paper about it was about looking at animals. One part of it was, and it was about looking at. A lot of people think when they look at animals, animals are just sort of sitting there being looked at. That they're not looking at us. And she referred to a great study that she and I have talked about several times, which is the facial recognition study done on corvids, crows, and ravens, and they are definitely looking at you.
Yeah.
And that's the intelligence. I think um, we have not we definitely do not fully understand animal intelligence. There's no way. And
Do
I
you
think we're
think?
going to find out all sorts of things after
Yeah.
you and I probably are gone.
Yeah.
We're going to have to reconsider our own intelligence.
But do you think like I feel like what humans call progress. I've often asked the question and nobody has come up with a reasonable answer to me yet. What humans call progress, if any other entity in the world could speak, what do you think they'd call it? I don't think it'd be progress.
I think they would call it destruction.
I think they'd call it destruction too. I think they
Yeah.
absolutely would. But do you think um, the the indigenous kind of tribal way of being from thousands of years ago and still active maybe in some parts of the world, do you think they take account of the intelligence of nature? I mean, we speak like, oh, we're going to find this out eventually. I think it's already been known. I think that this kind of Western enlightened idea of science doesn't take account of it. And it's simply because, well, there's no evidence. There's no evidence. I always like to say, well, that doesn't mean there isn't a crime. It's
Yeah.
like, but yet it seems to have been taken account of for a lot of human history up until the past few hundred years. That yeah, nature
Well,
has an intelligence.
yeah. I mean, maybe just it's the case, I think, that indigenous people looked at the world in a different way and therefore actually saw things that we do not see. Um, they're in the natural world in ways that we are not.
Absolutely.
And I find, I honestly find, right, when people refer to indigenous cultures as primitive, I find that to be really problematic, very problematic. They took up with nature and reality in a distinct way. That does not make it primitive. And that gets to your, we could talk about this another time, the myth of progress.
Yeah.
Progress, right? I
Yeah.
mean, and
Yeah.
now it's assumed, right? Any sort of technological innovation has to be progress. And that's clearly a fallacy. Call that the technological fallacy.
Yeah.
Um, but anyway, I
Yeah.
should
No.
probably think about. I probably have to wind down here.
No problem, John. I was just about to let you go. One final question. It's a question that I've been thinking that I can ask every guest. Um,
Sure.
and that is, do you have an epiphany that has changed the way you think more than any other that happened throughout your life? Is there one epiphany that you can say that was a moment of enlightenment that I can never go back into to before?
I actually think I've had several, and I will explain something to you about my own development that I think that actually matters for others, which is, when I was a graduate student in philosophy at University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, I I had been a literature philosophy major. I studied science too in college, but I was, I loved literature. And then when I got into grad school in philosophy, I was around all these analytic philosophers, and I took up this view that fiction was worthless. I'm not going to read any more novels because, well, I mean, I need to study philosophy and I need to study science and learn about the nature of things. And fiction is just, fiction. And given everything we've talked about today, I think you can pretty much see that I've gone in radically the other direction.
Yeah.
And I guess I regard that in my own view as a maturity. I've kind of grown up.
Yeah.
And right, the burden then becomes, right, how to relay that to other people without being myself so certain. And that's why I love to teach.
That's that's excellent, John. That's definitely food for thought, and you've given us a lot of food for thought here, and I really
Well,
appreciate you.
you've given me food for thought too. I really appreciate being able to come on and talk to you. It's been really fun.
Thanks, John. Thanks a lot, and
Very enjoyable.
I definitely hope you'll be back sometime, and
I'd
we'll
love to.
talk again. Okay,
Let's stay in
thank you,
touch.
John. Absolutely.
Great to